For those that are anti-big pharma, myself included, doesn't this give big pharma the opportunity to move closer toward plant medicine? Doesn't this open up a new door to maybe have big pharma reinvent itself, and to normalize the plant? So is it a bad thing? I don't know the answer to that. Is it a good thing? I don't know the answer to that either. But what I do know is that the cannabis industry, in all the decades it's existed, while it has moved the needle in many ways, perhaps maybe it hasn't moved the needle enough.
Doing things by the book. David Paleschuck needs little introduction to many of us working in the cannabis industry. The seasoned marketer and author of Branding Bud is back with a new book, Cannabis versus Marijuana, Language, Landscape and Context, in which he delves deeper into how we should talk about our favourite plant and what words we should use.
And hello and welcome to the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that is very close to my heart, and it's not just about cannabis, it's about words as well. But, you know, I'm a writer, I'm a sort of wordsmith, or at least that's what I tell people. But the man we're going to be speaking to now, Mr. David Paleschuck, he is an established author, particularly in the sort of cannabis sort of canon. Cannabis canon? Can we say, does that work? I think it kind of works. But he's just written a new book, and he's going to come and tell us all about it. Welcome to the show, David. How are you doing? Good to see you, sir.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. And I have been taking a look at your new book. I haven't finished it yet, but it's Cannabis versus Marijuana. So we're talking about language, landscape, and context. Tell us a little bit more about the book, because it's a really interesting topic. But from what I've read so far, it's not just about, what words, because I've spoken to a lot of people within the industry, and they're always very like, you can't say black market, you have to say illicit market. You can't say, we talk about cannabis, not marijuana. Why does it matter? And what's the kind of difference? And what's your thoughts? So tell us a little bit more about the sort of direction the book has taken you in.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll start off that words are very important. Words often have a lot of baggage. And in the cannabis world, I mean, there could be nothing more true. I want to say it was probably a couple of years back. I went I live here in Washington State in Seattle in the US, and I went to an event, a political event, where they were asking for people's opinions. And I had shared a couple of my opinions during the event. And then at the end, I spoke to a politician. And one of the first things he said to me was, "You don't use marijuana, do you? Because you don't look like you do." And, my head spun and I was like, "No, I don't use marijuana. I consume cannabis." And then his head started spinning and he didn't understand what I was saying. And that's when I realized that use and marijuana were very loaded, and he was using them in a loaded way, and that words can be loaded. And so it's important for us to think about the words we use, really depending on who we're speaking to and who we're engaging with and what is the objective of our conversation. So in the cannabis space, my role as an activist has been to normalize the plant and to remove stigma. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I need to be very mindful about the words I use. And if I'm going to build bridges with researchers, with doctors, with scientists, with policymakers, with politicians, I'd best be using their words, or it behooves me to use their language than it does for me to use weed language or euphemisms or slang. Again, because those are loaded. So in that was really the inception. That was really the light bulb that went off in terms of, wow, it's really important to discuss how we talk about cannabis. And, to your point earlier, everybody in the industry is, at least in the industry, is very aware of it. Some people now are saying we're taking back the word marijuana, and likening it to the N word, which I call out and say that's an absolute terrible analogy, because the N word now cannot be used by certain people and can be used by others. So it's a bad analogy in terms of,
it's more of a kind of, it's not just a cultural, it's a racial thing. And again, what surprised me, and I mean, and then what might surprise other people, to learn that the word marijuana had its kind of roots essentially, well, when used in conjunction with prohibition, as basically a sort of racist term. It was sort of, this is the sort of thing that immigrants are smoking and things like that. So it was very much maligned in line with a lot of these kind of racist policies, which again sort of played into this wider sort of paranoia of the time, which is again it's fascinating, and you hadn't even realized that was the case.
Yeah, well, so here's what's interesting. And to be honest with you, I don't believe in conspiracies, because I don't think people are smart enough to create conspiracies. I think they often connect dots after the fact. But here is a conspiracy that I do believe. In the 1930s, Harry Anslinger, who is the head of what is today the DEA, was basically in charge of prohibition, alcohol prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, prior to the Marijuana Tax Act, there was hemp being grown. Well, early in the colonial days, hemp was mandated to be grown by farmers. A certain amount of their property and their farm needed to be allocated toward hemp, and that was for ropes. That was for all things that that the government required.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's like over here as well in the UK. I mean, we have towns like Hemel Hempstead, in Hertfordshire, which is north of London. Again, it's so deeply entrenched in the growth of hemp as a, not just as medicine, but as a fiber, is still very much grounded in what we have here as well as a sort of cultural history. But I guess again, people don't really. It feels so kind of far back. But I guess we're talking about less than 100 years ago in this case, aren't we?
Absolutely. And there's a town in New York called Hempstead as well. So what did happen is, so once alcohol prohibition went away, you now had a department, of the United States government that really didn't have a role to play. They weren't policing alcohol anymore. What's interesting is Harry Anslinger, who headed up that department, was also married to somebody from the Hearst family. Now, the Hearst family was in newspapers. Newspapers at that time were going through a push and pull of whether they were printed on hemp or whether they were printed on wood pulp, on paper. And so the conspiracy goes that Harry Anslinger helped hemp to be legal, to be made illegal, and prohibition started with cannabis, primarily because his family was connected to a big newspaper baron. Now, that newspaper baron also had ties into the paper pulp industry because they were printing on paper. So in turn, what happened was there was the Marijuana Tax Act. There was also the focus of marijuana and the use of the word now associated with Mexican immigrants and African Americans, and jazz players, and all of those things happening. And that's basically why, and when, more specifically, when the word marijuana started to have negative and racist connotations. What's interesting, I should say, is that's in the US, because there are folks in Mexico that I've had conversations with, and they're like, you're crazy. Like, that word doesn't have any of that baggage here. But here in the United States, it does. So, as we start to look at those words, the first words being cannabis versus marijuana, but then the book really opens up to more things like adult use versus recreational. Recreational is not the right term. Adult use implies responsibility, thoughtfulness, 21
Well,
and above. All
I've
these
got to be honest. To my mind, when I think adult, I think of I think of pornography. But then that's probably just my one-track mind from youth. Obviously, when I was a lot younger. But no, I think it's interesting. And again, you were talking about the context and how that matters. And again, it sounds a lot like sort of code switching. Where you've kind of got, I mean, people who are sort of from two cultures or something like that. They speak fluent one language and they speak, English at home, no, with friends, but at home they might speak a different language, like their parents' language and things like that. But it's not just a linguistic switch. It's a kind of like, this is how this behavior manifests differently to how it will with this. And I guess that also plays a part in a lot of what you're saying as well. It's not just the historical aspects. It's not just the kind of current. It's the kind of, it's very much that, who are we talking to and what is there, what's appropriate to that situation. Like we're talking with like the politician example, the cannabis versus marijuana, to kind of progress and to kind of relate to people around the topic of cannabis. It's so vast, it's not any one thing. And I think that's something that's easy to almost lose sight of.
Absolutely. And a lot of times people will say, do you use marijuana? Do you smoke marijuana? And I say, well, it's cannabis. And there's so many form factors that, there's inhalation, there's ingestion, there's transdermal. There's so many different things that smoking is just one means of uptake these days.
Yeah.
But even the words use versus consume, as a consumer, right? And we all are consumers. So as a consumer, we walk into a shop, we're very mindful of the products, the ingredients, the pricing, the value, all these other things, right, as consumers. And then all of a sudden we become a user, at a certain point to certain people. So again, it's these words are so nuanced, but there's meaning and implication in the words that we choose or not choose, quite frankly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's almost like, again, that word use. I always feel like that is so very sort of, for me, sort of growing up, sort of the 80s and 90s, and talk about people being drug users and things like that. But for me, thinking about, do we consume? Well, consume for me means like, kind of eat sort of thing. And it's like, we don't. Well, you suppose you do if we have edibles, but again, it's finding the right sort of terminology, and we have to kind of lean into what already exists rather than sort of, and what feels like the right thing, even if it's not a direct kind of, it's not sort of square peg round hole. It's kind of just slightly the wrong shape, but we'll use it anyway because there is no better alternative. And I feel like that's the case with like use. Because I really feel like there's a difference between use and abuse, and anything can be abused, whether it be alcohol, coffee, cannabis, whatever. But again, use has a different kind of implication, but still it has that tinge of, talk about it in the context of cannabis, you're still harking back to kind of like Reagan drug use, kind of drug abuse. And we used to have here, there was the just say no campaign, where they had kids from TV shows sort of telling, say no to drugs, kids, and it's all that kind of, it still feels like, when I think of drug users, I think of, people, I see these public service things as a kid, people with like needles hanging out their arms and, and again, like you say, there's so much just in a word and a context, isn't there? It's so nuanced and, it's fascinating.
And, going from use to user or use to abuse or abuser, that's, in my experience, that's just one step away. And then once you get into the abuser, then the next thing is we're talking about the gateway drug. And it's just the same recording over and over and over again, right? So we almost use these words habitually, we've found the right phrases to regurgitate instead of really thinking through. There's a few things just to call out. I mean, one, as cannabis and cannabis normalization globalizes and becomes legal, we're not only talking about politicians and policymakers, but we're talking about researchers, we're talking about scientists, we're talking about, in the global context. We're talking about people that speak different languages. We're talking about all those meanings that cannabis has within those different societies. Traditional Thai medicine or Indian, and Hindus take a look at it very differently than Western culture.
Because it's sort of inherent in Ayurvedic medicine in India, and and I guess a lot of kind of folk medicine from sort of other sort of indigenous cultures, and it has a long history of being used in that way. And again, it's like, oh, you use that's cannabis, but coming along and sort of pointing that out, that adds a new context on it, but that's from our own perception from, anyway.
Yeah. And, even further, so there's cannabis versus marijuana, there's use versus consume, there's adult versus recreational. Even further, in the industry, we call varieties, strains. Strains have everything to do with viruses and bacteria and nothing to do with horticulture or botany. We should be calling cultivars. And variety is the word of plant evolution within nature, which would, let's just say, naturally evolving. And cultivar, which comes from cultivated variety, is man-made or human-made, and crossbreeding and so on and so forth. And so, we don't even use those terms correctly. So now, when there's research done and there's an interaction between people in the cannabis industry and scientists, let's say, you've got people in the industry calling it strains, and they're talking to scientists, and scientists are thinking, well, strains have everything to do with bacteria and viruses and nothing to do with horticulture and botany. What are these people talking about? So it's just, or in New York recently, they were calling it flavors. So it's just so interesting to see how we're using words which are really, really within boxes, right? And we need to figure out maybe the more broader used terms or scientific terms that, that a scientist or a doctor or a nurse or somebody other than in the industry can relate to.
Yeah. But just to play devil's advocate for a sec, it's almost as though, there's no one kind of source of truth, or is there a source? Should we be using the same terminologies as scientists because that's, I guess, biologically, or whatever you want to call it, the most accurate? But again, to use very scientific terms in kind of day-to-day or even business language, it's not, again, it's open to kind of interpretation, or people might not know those terminologies, or they might feel it's a bit overly formal or overly complex to kind of talk. So do you feel like there is a single source of truth that we should be pursuing when it comes to how we talk about it? Or do you really feel as though we need to kind of have a wider sort of glossary of things and, use those accordingly? How do you see that kind of evolving over time as well? Do you think we're veering towards a kind of common vocabulary around cannabis and, how it meant, is there a common vocabulary coming about?
Well, okay. So I can't say this enough or emphasize this enough. Context is everything, right? So with context being the number one aspect related to our conversation, if you're with friends and you call cannabis weed, I am not proposing that you change your language and amongst your friends, you use the word cannabis instead of weed. What I am proposing is, depending on who you're talking to and what their feelings are and experiences with cannabis, we should be mindful of the words we use. And so, and again, I'll keep it simple. If an American, and I've seen this so many times, an American in Paris walking down the Champs-Élysées needs directions, they walk right up to the French person and say in English, "Can you point me to the Eiffel Tower?" And more often than not, French people do speak English, but they also, understand that they're in their home country where they speak French. And if anybody is on their turf in their city asking for directions, at the very least, perhaps that American or that tourist, should say, "Excuse me, I don't speak French. Do you speak English? Can you help me?" In French. So at least you start the conversation, you open it up, you show them respect for their culture, you show them respect for their perspective. You don't do what I've seen most Americans do, is when they say, "Excuse me, I don't understand you," in French, the American says it louder, and gets in their face.
Well, that could even be a British person in Spain, to be honest with you, or any other given country. To be fair, but
exactly.
again, but yeah.
Not to pick on Americans, although I'm American, so I think
you can pick on them. I can pick on the British. That's fine. Yeah, we're good.
But so context is everything, right? Let me give you another example. If you're in the U.S. and you're talking about the Second Amendment, which is gun control, if you which is the right to own a gun,
right to bear arms, or is that right? Yeah,
it's correct.
Yes.
So if you went into a group of people and you said, "Let's talk about gun control for a moment," you would absolutely lose at least half of those people, because they don't believe in gun control, because there's a Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Now, if you went into that conversation and said, "Let's talk about responsible gun ownership," now at least you haven't alienated them. And if they're law-abiding citizens, they'll say, "Of course, who doesn't believe in responsible gun ownership?" And so it's that same sort of approach. If you're going to have a conversation with a person or a group of people about a loaded topic, you should best think about how to approach them and how to open that conversation and what words to use. And even further, you had and have a great quote in the book, thank you very much, where you talk
Page
about
222, yeah.
where you talk about legal terms, colloquial terms, cultural terms, and how there really is a place for all of these. But the concept is to be mindful, right? When you're using these words, know who you're talking to, know how you're getting your point across. I saw in Thailand recently a number of tourists come in looking for certain strains or certain, I should say cultivars, or certain, but I feel comfortable with you, Dave. That's
okay.
why.
No, it's all good. No, we're all friends here. It's cool.
But the idea being that they, let's say Australians, had heard or used certain words and speak certain words. They get to Thailand, they walk into a dispensary and they ask for this. They ask for something in the words they use, and the Thai bud tenders behind the counter have no idea what they're talking about. And I saw this firsthand, where they pull open, they pull out their phone, they go to Instagram to look for something, or they go to a dictionary to look for something, or a slang euphemism dictionary, just to figure out what's being said. So I've seen it both on the cultural level, on the industry level, as well as on the formal, cross-cultural, cross-industry, cross-political span, where people don't even know what we're talking about. So if cannabis is going to globalize, which it is, and legalize, which it's moving slowly in that direction. So now we are talking to policymakers and researchers and medical people and people that speak different languages, etc. So we really need to be more mindful about the words we're using and selecting to get our points across.
No, I think you're right. I mean, again, I'm always harping on about trying to break outside of the kind of cannabis echo chamber. But I feel like those of us that are in it almost need to have, again, it's that kind of, like you were saying earlier, you consider yourself an activist. I think everybody involved in the industry needs that kind of bone of activism to kind of, bang the drum about something that has been so kind of much maligned for a century now. It's almost like, do you feel that there's a responsibility for people like us in the industry to be more sort of accommodating in a way that will almost kind of set the precedent and say, well, actually, I do understand when I'm talking to this person, who may not have any understanding of it. I need to be able to show them what I think is an appropriate thing to say or to refer to. Do you feel like there's a responsibility for the sector to do that?
I do. I definitely do. If we're all moving in a direction to legalize the plant and normalize the plant, then I believe it behooves the industry to be mindful about how they speak about the plant. You know, there is evidence, there is research that shows that using the right words does change people's perception, and we have seen over time. I mean, while I take exception to this term, and I can go into that in a minute, the term medical marijuana was created for a reason. Personally, and again, I'm in the US, so I think about it in US terms. I think of cannabis as medicinal or therapeutic. I don't think of it as medical. Why? Because medical, a doctor would prescribe, a pharmacy would distribute, insurance would cover it. There would be specific dosing. It would be really more regulated and standardized, but it's not. Now, having said that, so I feel calling it medical marijuana is giving it perhaps maybe more juice than it really deserves at this point. And when I say that, medical marijuana implies that we've already done what we needed to do, that we've succeeded, and in my opinion, we still have so long to go.
I mean, like, it's already a thing.
That's right.
But it's not. But it's still evolving into being a thing, and that isn't the thing that it should be. Almost. Correct.
On the roadmap to normalizing the plant, to having it accepted by people and by doctors and by insurance companies and pharmacists, we're still on that road. So to call it medical marijuana, while I understand why it was called that and why it is called that, which is, very much what I'm talking about. It's moving it further down the road, down this roadmap to legalization, into acceptance. So I get that. The double M, the medical marijuana, always flows from our tongue, but I believe it's medicinal and therapeutic more than it is medical, and I will call it medical when doctors prescribe it, pharmacists distribute it, and insurance companies pay for it, just like any other medical product or medicine. So is it medicinal? Yes. Is it therapeutic? Yes. But I still think we have a long way to go. Coming back to my point, though, is that, and I also want to reiterate, not to take away anything from those people that coined the term and fought for it to, again, normalize the plant, because we are on the same page. We are trying to normalize the plant. But there is research that shows, over the course of time, when we went from marijuana to medical cannabis to adult use cannabis, that there is more acceptance and there is more openness to the plant when we use specific words. I want to say the right words, but specific words.
No, so, I mean, this right is always, it's open to interpretation, isn't it? That's the thing.
It is, and that's where we come back full circle to your question about the truth. What is the truth? Here's the truth. Your truth and my truth might be very different. So that's the truth, which brings it back to context, and which brings it back to, if we're having a conversation and two people or multiple people have many truths, then we need to be mindful of the words we use, so we build bridges instead of destroy bridges. So we learn how to communicate instead of shut each other down.
No, that's very true. I was going to ask, do you feel like this is going to become increasingly important given, recent developments in the US around the kind of proposed rescheduling, or again, reschedule, deschedule, again, the terminology is slightly nebulous. But do you feel like, as government take more notice, as the sort of, dare we say, edging towards federal legalization of cannabis in the United States, do you feel like the way in which, politicians communicate with each other and with, their, what do you want to call it, like their constituents, that's almost going to be more definitive in a way in terms of kind of broader narratives around the words we use around cannabis?
Absolutely. And by the way, I think that word is schedule, not schedule.
Okay. Again, it's a potato, tomato. Yeah,
exactly. I think there's a few things. I think as we move into, and this is U.S. specific. So currently, cannabis is a Schedule I drug. Other Schedule I drugs are heroin. And other things along those lines. So the first question really is is heroin and cannabis on the same level? And I think we could all agree it's not. So now there's the talk of either rescheduling to a Schedule III drug or descheduling, which some people call decontrolling. So having said that, basically, and by the way, there has been, rebuttals from those that deal with the Controlled Substance Act in terms of, the DEA saying we don't deschedule. And again, what they could do is decontrol. But again, they use words to evade, the topic at hand, which is really interesting. But nonetheless, so here's some of the ramifications. So right now, as a Schedule I drug, there is what's called the 280E tax. The 280E tax is basically a tax that almost puts a 60 to 80% tax on cannabis companies and forbids them to expense certain things in their business where a normal business would be able to.
Yeah.
Let's say a restaurant. A restaurant can hire an architect and design a beautiful interior and spend $1 million on art and be able to expense all of that. A cannabis company is not able to do that. What does that do in turn? It lowers their profit margins. So therefore, with lower profit margins, you have fewer investors coming into the cannabis space and the cannabis industry. So by rescheduling and eliminating the 280E tax, cannabis companies will be more profitable. Hopefully, that will drive more investors into the industry. If there's more investors in the industry, it will more likely than not proliferate the industry, grow the industry, and also normalize the industry relative to investors and those that think about investing. Now, it should also open up the doors to big pharma that will start to do research and start to do testing and start to do all the things that big pharma does. There's a lot of people which are absolutely against that in the industry and fear that will take away from mom and pop shops and dispensaries and perhaps even the way that cannabis is distributed now. I don't think that, because I believe if that was really the case, they'd be doing that already and they'd be pushing for that already. There's another thought that I have, which is probably even controversial, which is why is it a bad thing that big pharma comes into the industry? Now, I'm not a fan of big pharma to date, but if this would bring big pharma in to the industry, and we know that big pharma can move things through the FDA, they can get things done, they can work on standardization and dosing. Those things are all good in my opinion. It moves it more toward medical, where doctors will actually, it's big pharma that sponsors medical schools, and it's big pharma that gets courses and new topics to be studied by doctors. So if doctors are brought up to speed on, the the endocannabinoid system, and they're more in line with what's going on, then doctors become more knowledgeable. Again, pharmacists become more knowledgeable, insurance companies pay for it, and it really becomes medical. And finally, just the last thought around this is, for those that are anti-big pharma, myself included, doesn't this give big pharma the opportunity to move closer toward plant medicine? Doesn't this open up a new door to maybe have big pharma reinvent itself, and to normalize the plant? So is it a bad thing? I don't know the answer to that. Is it a good thing? I don't know the answer to that either. But what I do know is that the cannabis industry, in all the decades it's existed, while it has moved the needle in many ways, perhaps maybe it hasn't moved the needle enough. And so we need rescheduling and big pharma to come in again to finish the job.
No, I've heard, no, again, I've heard the exact same thing said about the tobacco industry as well, sort of diversifying into cannabis. Again, the idea that, tobacco has the kind of, the experience of navigating highly regulated products, and being able to they've got the supply chains, the distribution networks and things like that. Does it, again, present the opportunity for an industry that has, again, caused real harm to a kind of atone for its sins by diversifying into cannabis? People I've asked have said, well, maybe, but that's not going to be their primary kind of motivation. It's more about safeguarding the industry's kind of future in a way. But again, it's one of those things. Does it present an opportunity? Yes, but is it the right opportunity? And I think, again, it's about which direction. And maybe there will be multiple directions that cannabis will take in terms of, will it be treated like a tobacco product or an alcohol product in the same way, or a pharmaceutical, or will it, do you know what I mean? Or maybe it will be all of those things and nothing else. And I think that's why there's always such, I won't say controversy, it's always kind of that, all these multiple kind of contexts. And I think that's why what you're doing with the book is really important in terms of, well, be mindful of these contexts. And, it's not just about calling one thing. And I've heard, again, it's similar to the kind of debate. I mean, people talking about, well, I want to be politically correct, but everyone seems to be offended by everything. I was like, well, it's just about being respectful to the individual that you're dealing with, and, informing yourself about the real challenges of something you don't necessarily understand in the same way as someone, for example, someone who's trans or something like that, who, they've been through, the ordeal of accepting who they are and now want to present in a certain way. So you owe it to them to be a respectful person, to speak to them, use the pronouns that they prefer. And you see perhaps a similar, perhaps that's an interesting parallel. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it's using the words that best appeal to the people you're speaking to. Certainly, if you're trying to convince them or convert them, you should probably be speaking their language. And it's interesting, and you're absolutely right. About big pharma, tobacco. Look, big alcohol has not only lobbied against cannabis, but it has also invested in some of the biggest cannabis companies. They're playing both. They're openly playing both sides of the fence. So they'll win either way, or they'll mitigate their losses either way. So, but I think it's also important for us to realize, we in the Western world, in Europe and America, live in a capitalistic society. This is the way things work. We shouldn't kid ourselves. We should understand that it's for profit, and big pharma and alcohol and tobacco are part of it. They're part of the game. So we should understand that. We shouldn't be foolish to think that they're coming in for altruistic reasons. Now, one other thing you said also too, if you think about the tomato model, tomatoes I could grow in my own backyard. I could go down to the bodega and get a cheap tomato. I could go to Whole Foods and get an heirloom tomato and spend $20 on it. or I could go, get tomato paste or canned tomatoes. So at the end of the day, tomatoes are available in so many channels, including my own backyard. And so I could see cannabis potentially falling into that, where if you want medicine,
Mhm.
You'll get it in pill form, which is highly dosed and very specific through your pharmacist, covered by insurance. Or you could grow it in your own backyard, or you could go to a dispensary and get it. There's so many different ways and form factors for us to find it in. So
Mhm.
I could see that as an opportunity too, where it's not really limited to a specific channel or distribution point, but rather like a tomato, where you could go buy seeds, you could go buy clones, you could buy all these different things to produce your own tomatoes, or purchase your own tomatoes across multiple channels. I mean, that would probably be the optimum situation, but we'll see if that happens too.
Yeah, and I have to correct you on the tomato is the pronunciation. I think
Yes. Yes.
No, but no, you're absolutely right. I think again, as the industry sort of matures, there's going to be more kind of diversity within it, and I think it's important to obviously stay dialed into what that is and to understand the different nuances and the context and all of that sort of stuff. But no, this is great. I'm going to sort of wrap it up a little bit here, but I'm going to say one more thing. It's like I'm going to quote Cher. The great sort of it's words are like weapons; they can wound sometimes. So yeah,
Very well.
there we go. Very wise. The sage Cher. Hat tip to her. But no, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on, David, and telling us. And where can we find your book? Is it available in all good stores and on the Amazon as well?
Yeah, here's the book.
Yay! There we go.
Juana.
As if by magic.
Amazon is the best place to find it for sure.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Cool. Well, thanks again. And I promise to finish reading it because I'm where am I? Sort of chapter 6 now. So it's just hotting up. So yeah, it's good. Thank you so much for coming on and thanks for sharing. And we will speak to you soon.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think about it when you're done. And if anybody wants to check me out, feel free to check me out at brandingbud.com or reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can find me there.
Awesome. Thanks, David. All right. Have a great rest of the day and speak soon.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.